You can make a long workflow more manageable and flexible by breaking the steps into several shorter workflows. Using multiple workflows can prevent an invoice from being applied to the project too early and even stop actions from running by accident if a client never completes their booking. The best way to divide your workflow is into logical phases, creating a separate workflow for each phase. There's no one-size-fits-all approach, but many processes seem to have three basic phases. The inquiry phase covers the steps immediately following an initial inquiry from a client. This phase might include sending out an automated email response, checking your availability, and scheduling a consultation with the client. The proposal or booking phase covers the steps you take to get the client signed on to work with you. This is usually a short phase, just covering sending out the proposal and any reminders. It acts as a buffer between the inquiry phase and the phase that begins once the client is considered booked to ensure important steps like getting a signed contract and initial payment occur before you start work with the client. The booked phase begins once you consider the client to be booked. It might start with sending out an additional questionnaire or onboarding materials. Depending on how simple or complex your service is, you might have just one booked phase that goes all the way to the end of completing work, or you might have more phases to further break things up. There's no ideal number of steps in a workflow, but the longer the workflow is, the more difficult it can be to read through and manage once it's on a project. If you already built one big workflow, don't worry. Splitting the workflow up is easy to do without undoing all your hard work. Under Templates, Workflows, select the workflow template you'd like to break down into phases. Click on the duplicate icon to make a copy of the workflow. Make as many copies of the workflow as you have phases planned. Leave the original workflow intact just in case you want to start over. Click on one of the copies and click on the gear icon to edit it. Adjust the title so you know which phase this is. Adding a number is a good way to stay organized. Start by finding the last action that will be in this phase. Remove all of the actions below it. Edit each of the remaining copies of the workflow to delete the actions that don't belong in each phase. Note that you may need to change some of your triggers around. For example, this trigger will no longer work correctly because the scheduler it's set to watch is being sent through a different workflow. Since this action is now the first action to run once the workflow is applied, the trigger after all previous actions complete is a suitable replacement. If you use project date triggers, splitting your workflow into phases is especially important. With one long workflow, actions triggered by the project date will still run even if the client never actually signs the contract and pays the invoice. Having a booked workflow lets you base actions on the project date without those actions running unless the booked workflow is applied. When you're finished, double check that you don't have any triggers watching templates sent in different workflows. If you're using a payment schedule in the workflow, we recommend that you remove the payment schedule from all the workflows except from the one that sends the proposal. Now that you have your 3 separate workflows, it's time to decide how you'd like each one to start. The inquiry workflow could be applied by the lead capture form just like the original workflow. The proposal workflow needs to start after you have the consultation that was booked at the end of the inquiry workflow. If you want to decide whether or not to apply the proposal workflow based on the outcome of the call, you will not add anything to the inquiry workflow to start the proposal workflow automatically. Instead, you'll plan on manually applying the proposal workflow after the consultation ends. The booked workflow should start as soon as the client is considered to be booked. In the proposal workflow, we already have 2 hold actions watching for the contract to be signed and a scheduled payment to be completed. At the bottom of the workflow, add a start a workflow action triggered after all previous actions complete. Now the booked workflow will automatically be applied to the project after the client signs and pays.